Before we begin our tailored jacket, we need to learn a variety of hand stitches. These are very important for the precision stitching that we will be doing. I'd like to say a couple of things about needles first. The needles that are strongly suggested for tailoring are sharps, which we have here, and betweens. Betweens are shorter and stronger, and a short needle is good for short single stitches, such as pad stitching. A lot of people like to use betweens for pad stitching. Sharps are medium to long, and the higher the number, the shorter and thinner the needle. A number 7 sharp is the most popular for tailoring. A longer needle is good for multiple stitches, such as basting. I will have to admit, these needles, the eyes are so tiny that I can't see to thread them, not even with my needle threader. So I go for the big eye, and I like to use embroidery needles. They're not as thin, but I will use the thinnest one I can. My friend Kenneth likes the number 10 millinery needle. So don't feel required to use sharps or betweens, but they are recommended for tailoring. I'd like to say a little bit about threads. Most hand sewing is done with a single thread, silk or cotton. Mercerized cotton, number 0 or 00, or silk thread size A. For the numbered threads, such as the mercerized cotton, the higher the number, the finer the thread. Median is 50. For letters, such as the silk thread, A is fine and D is heavy. For basting, silk thread is easier to remove. White cotton, number 40 to 50, is easy to break and remove. A few tips to keep your thread from knotting when hand sewing. Thread the needle with the end that was cut from the spool. If you don't have luck threading the eye from one direction, turn the needle and try threading it from the other direction, because the needle is engineered differently on both sides. Also, don't use too long a thread. The thread should measure the distance from the tip of your fingers to your elbow, which is usually 18 to 24 inches. Yes, you will be threading the needle more often, but you will have less broken thread, which is very, very frustrating. Don't pull or tug on the thread, and wax it. That helps a lot. I like to wax my thread for hand sewing. Another tip, cut your thread at an angle when you are cutting it from the spool. Before beginning a row of stitching and ending a row of stitching, you need to fasten your thread. And a very nice stitch for this is the back stitch. You may use knots, but they're harder to get out when you're basting. I would recommend that you never use a knot when you're using a basting stitch. And sometimes they just get in the way, they cause a bump. A back stitch is flatter and it's very, very strong. To begin your row of stitching, leave a tail. I'm just going to do one back stitch here. Leave a tail of about 4 inches and take 2 stitches in place, 2 tiny stitches in place. This is very strong, and it really is kind of hard to get out. So there you have the back stitch. That is a fastening stitch, and that is the way to begin and end a row of stitching. You would use a smaller back stitch for a permanent row of stitching and a longer back stitch for basting. And if you want something really secure, add a loop. When you make your second stitch, pass your needle through, and that will make it even more secure. So there we have the back stitch as a fastening stitch. The first stitch that all sewists should know is the basic running stitch. And by the way, I am using craft thread for clarity. I began with my back stitch and cut off the tail before beginning so that it wouldn't get caught. I've also marked my stitching line, and this is meant to be a permanent stitch. So what you'll do is you will go in and out, you'll weave the needle in and out in evenly spaced 1/8 inch stitches, several of them before pulling the thread through. I'm going to go ahead and pull the thread through now so you can see what it looks like. This is the running stitch. For all of these hand stitches, don't pull the threads too tightly. When you get to the end, do another fastening stitch. Here's our completed sample. Hand basting is used to temporarily hold 2 layers of fabric together. Even basting is used on smooth fabrics and in areas that require close control, such as curved seams and set-in sleeves. Uneven basting is used for general basting where less control is required. Right now I'm going to show even basting, and I will go ahead and do my fastening stitch. In this case, because it's basting, I'm still going to leave my tail, but I'm going to make a longer stitch. This will be 1/4 of an inch instead of 1/8 of an inch. I also think I'm just going to do 1. That's plenty. This really is just a running stitch with longer stitches spaced evenly apart. So the instructions are the same. You will weave the needle in and out before pulling it through, and this would be 1/4 inch long stitches. And if you're doing a very long row, I've done this so many times, take an occasional back stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and do this again. Sometimes I even do 3/8 instead of 1/4. But they do need to be evenly spaced and even length. I will take just a little tiny back stitch here before continuing. Here's my even basting sample. We have our fastening stitch at the beginning, a longer stitch, 1/4 of an inch. And then our stitches are spaced 1/4 of an inch apart, and they're 1/4 of an inch long. And right here, I took 1 back stitch. And I wouldn't do it on a sample this small normally, but if you're doing a very long line of even basting, an occasional back stitch just helps everything keep from shifting. Now we will do uneven basting, which is also known as long and short basting. Once again, I started with my fastening stitch, my longer back stitch. This is usually done with a single thread of a contrasting color. What you do is you take a small stitch, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch long, and then a second stitch 1/2 inch to 1 inch long. So I have my 1/4 inch long stitch, and then this one, which is almost 1 inch, and another 1/4, and then another longer stitch. Here's our completed sample of uneven basting. We're now going to do the back stitch. This is a very strong and versatile stitch. In tailoring, the back stitch is used to sew sleeves into the armhole or for the crotch seam. It's also used as a temporary basting stitch on the collar and lapels to keep several layers from shifting during pressing. Each stitch is formed by inserting the needle 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch behind the point where the thread emerges from the previous stitch. So I'm coming out here. This will be stitch number 1, and now I'm coming back just behind that first stitch. This stitch really does resemble a machine stitch. So right behind 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch where the previous stitching, right here where my needle is coming out, the stitch will go right behind there when it starts. These stitches, of course, can be smaller. Remember not to pull these too tightly. This is the back stitch. Slip basting is our next stitch. This is used to join a folded edge to a flat fabric so that motifs, checks, or stripes can be matched exactly. So I will take a very short straight stitch here in my flat fabric and then travel through the tunnel of my folded fabric. So we've traveled 1/4 inch in our fold. We'll come out and repeat. A very short stitch in our flat fabric, then go into the fold, travel about 1/4 inch, and come out. And we'll do this all the way across. This is the slip stitch. Slip stitching invisibly joins the folded edge of the lining hem or finished edges of pockets and welts to the garment. Here's a beautiful example of a welt being attached to the face fabric with a slip stitch. And here's the other side. Now we're going to do the prick stitch. This is a spaced back stitch and it's used mainly to hand pick a zipper. So what you're doing are tiny, evenly spaced stitches of 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch apart through all layers. And be sure not to pull these stitches too tightly. If you do, you'll make little dimples, impressions that won't be very attractive. Little tiny back stitch. And try to make these stitches evenly spaced. These stitches really do disappear into the fabric. They don't show. It's also called the sink stitch because it's used to join fabrics together through a ditch of a seam, such as a bound buttonhole. And then the prick stitch becomes a sink stitch. The stitches just sink right into the work. This is the prick stitch. Here, the prick stitch was used to apply a hand-picked zipper. So you can see on either side the little tiny short back stitches. They really do disappear. It's very nice. It's my favorite way to install a zipper. Now we're going to do Tailor's hem stitching. I folded the seam allowance of the hem back. I'm going to take a very small horizontal stitch in the garment, catching only a couple of threads, and we're working from right to left. So I'm taking a couple of threads here. Then I will take a stitch, a little tiny stitch in the hem allowance. Make sure that your stitches are evenly spaced, whether you're working with 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch. Once again, a couple of garment threads and a couple of threads in the fold of the hem allowance. This goes very, very quickly. This is Tailor's hem stitching. We will now do the catch stitch. This is a very secure stitch with some movement. It's used to hold a raw edge securely against a flat surface. We will be working from left to right, which is different from most all the other stitches. The stitches are horizontal. The stitches are angling from right to left, but we're traveling from left to right. And make sure to hold the thread on the left side of the needle. Once again, these stitches should not be pulled tightly. Holding the thread, the left side of the needle, taking my stitch, and now taking a stitch in the fabric. This is the catch stitch. In this jacket, you can see that the tape was stitched to the canvas with a catch stitch right here. This is the catch stitch. And in my man's tailored jacket, this is the catch stitch used decoratively. Actually, this is a cross stitch. So once the catch stitch was done, the stitch went back and crossed over itself. So here's another example of a decorative application.